Hello there, and it's like we got quite the crowd. Well, I do think that this is one of the more important topics to be discussing right now, the challenges the media is facing in an age of fake news, of covert state propaganda, of phony bots, and the way all of those are polluting the news environment. And we have three very experienced journalists here to talk about how they are dealing with this phenomenon. So I'd like to start out, Fiona, with you, because you mentioned when we were talking before that at BBC, you've got a whole project to combat the phenomenon of fake news. Tell us about that and how it works.
Well, at the BBC, obviously, we see our mission is to inform, educate and entertain. And in the run-up to the EU referendum, we further developed a product called Reality Check, and we put considerable investment behind that. And that really is our fact-checking service that we offer on digital platforms and on television and on radio. The great thing about it is it sources all the BBC's expertise across domestic and international territories. And for me, what I'm really passionate about is it's aimed at many diverse audiences. You know, we think about the female audience, we think about the younger audience, we think about the economically less well-off audience in the country, and we try and tailor what Reality Check says and the format in which it says it to those many audiences. You know, it's interesting to point out that BBC Online is reaching over 60% of the under 24-year-olds in Britain, something that I don't think we get enough credit for. And it shows that there is a real hunger for knowledge and explaining of high quality and veracity. So that is really what we're investing in.
But Fiona, how do you identify what fake news is? What stories out there that you feel the need to respond to?
For us, we're not necessarily out there chasing a viral dragon, you know, because we're trying to cater to many different audiences. We're looking at what are the debates going on in our own country or globally that we feel we need to add factual accuracy to. So it goes across a spectrum of, there's a piece we just published today on whether, you know, is domestic violence a signifier of, you know, a violent attacker, to a piece on who does the UK trade with under WTO rules right now. So it's not that we're out there reacting to what's viral or what's fake. We're following our public service agenda and what we think those audiences that are so important to us are really interested in, what is really relevant to their lives. Domestic violence, for example, being a really important issue, you know, for both sexes.
Quentin, I know from our panel yesterday, you can't speak for Google. But you are with Google.
But I can speak.
But you can speak. So Google is among the social media companies that has said it's going to try to combat the phenomenon of fake news. How is Google, same question to you, identifying what is fake news as opposed to stories that just have a different bias than you and I and some of the people in this room might have?
Great. Let me start with a disclaimer and a context.
I gave you the disclaimer
I am
already.
not part of Google News. I have no idea how Google sorts its news. I don't know. You know more about Google News policies than I do, possibly. But I do write inside Google, and I'm a third-generation journalist. And the problem of veracity has been with us forever. My grandfather was the congressional correspondent in the AP in the 1930s when a journalist got a Pulitzer Prize for reporting about how great life was in Stalin's Russia. Ignoring,
Walter Duranty of the New York Times.
There you go, Walter
Let's
Duranty.
be specific.
Kind of ignored the starvation of the Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Problem. My father was at Life magazine when they put on the cover the autobiography of Howard Hughes. Small problem, they got hoodwinked by Clifford Irving. The whole thing was made up.
Yeah.
The problem now is one of scale. What I do inside Google Cloud is write about this phenomenon of cloud computing and its endpoints, the advent of infinite communication and computation to every point on the planet, and a huge problem arises with truth and veracity inside that. I like what Fiona's doing very much. I think eventually in the literacy of truth and falsehood, you'll find people starting to talk about the vectors of information. How did this get to me? What was the original source? Was this passed on through a Twitter bot? In the background, how is this information reaching me? Will become part of the overall means of consumption. And I think players in cloud businesses can play a valuable role there, applying AI to all sorts of things, both in the production and the consumption of news.
Cameron, you oversaw or helped oversee the Washington Post's stellar political coverage during the 2016 election, in which you would have been right in the middle of this battle. And I just wondered what you had in the election was two competing versions of reality, in which a big chunk of the electorate, the chunk that actually prevailed, thinks much of what you wrote and edited was fake news. They didn't believe what you wrote, and they didn't accept your stories. Now, A, how frustrating is that as a longtime professional journalist, and B, how do you deal with it?
Well, I would challenge, Mike, the premise a little bit. I think that the overall excoriation of fake news is not directed at individual news organizations.
Well, the president
it's kind of a blanket,
of the United States,
right? It's kind of a blanket
fake news epithet at individual news organizations.
It's a blanket vilification, and I think that what we have seen, and what we saw in, the huge surge in readership that we experienced during the election, is that people were really hungry for accurate reporting. And we also found that even though the administration and the president himself wants to vilify us as fake news, we often write accurately about the administration in a way that compels him to act, right? That's why he no longer has Michael Flynn as his national security advisor.
Tell that story. Give us an example so people understand what you're talking about.
In February, we reported that Michael Flynn had been in conversation with the Russian ambassador, Sergei Kislyak, about sanctions in December, right after the election had happened. And this was problematic, but because it seemed to violate a law and was certainly inappropriate for an incoming administration to get ahead of its inauguration into office. So we reported that out. We took it to Michael Flynn, then the national security advisor. This story came together in February, and he denied it to us flat out. So we had a choice to make. Do we go with our sources, or do we respect the denial? And we held the story for a day. That was the decision of my boss, Marty Barron. We went back at it the next day, and at the same time, Michael Flynn's denial started to wither, and he relented. We published the story. He ultimately lost his job. Apparently that was not fake news. But the really interesting thing in this anecdote to me is that the night we published the story, a White House spokesman was on the phone with me saying, "Can you not report that Flynn initially denied the story? Can you keep that out of the story?" And so first of all, I explained to him, no, we can't keep that out of the story.
That was the story.
Here we are in this grand debate over veracity and public discourse. We're not going to withhold from our readers the fact that you lied to us about that. And at the same time, I thought to myself, and I'm having this phone conversation with this official, I thought, you know what? They do care. They don't want to be perceived as liars. They don't want to be perceived as people who don't tell the truth. And so this is the kind of thing that we know happens, right? We know that they are concerned with reality and how it's portrayed. Anytime we make a mistake, which we sometimes do in our coverage, we hear from them directly about the need to correct that, and we do correct it. But fake news is this blanket term, and what matters is in the day-to-day tussle.
I just want to
inside the,
go ahead.
I think this really brings up an interesting point around the economics of the news business these days, because obviously newspapers have been troubled for some time once they lost their kind of control of time and space for information and couldn't sell ads at the same rate they could before. The classified business disappeared under Craigslist. Now you want a subscription business, and the fact that you are a reliable source, you are a check, you are known for your reputation of being fully vetted, reliable, solid information is a major reason why people will subscribe to you. They are voting for what they, for well-checked facts when they write that check to you. And that's actually been great for your business. There is noise and there are bad things, but there's a new value arising in the subscription business because of the presence of bad information.
I just want to follow up, though, Cameron, on the example you gave, because it did remind me of an issue that has been flagged by your critics. That story, the Flynn story, like many of your scoops on the investigations into Donald Trump, relied on anonymous sources. And of course, there's always a problem with anonymous sources because you don't know, the reader doesn't know who these sources are, what their biases might be. And yet, I see as a reader a lot of the truly breaking journalism, front journalism, is relying a lot on anonymous sources. And I just wonder how you are dealing with that. How, is there any effort to try to get more people to go on the record to understand that we can't rely entirely on anonymous sources?
Absolutely. I think you've noticed that there is sort of this arms race in American journalism, especially covering the Trump administration. How many anonymous sources can you count up in your story? Right,
have confirmed this story
we spoke to 30 people, all of them on background for this story. So, I actually think that's kind of funny, and it gets a little ridiculous from time to time. But the impetus is the correct one, right? We want to tell people as much as we can about our sourcing without revealing who the sources are. There's an extent to which this is just inevitable. I mean, Mike, you know this very well from your work as well. If you want to get inside the secret government, if you want to cultivate sources who really know what's going on, and they don't wish to make themselves a sacrificial lamb, then they have to speak anonymously, and we have to vet them, and we have to tell readers as much as we possibly can about who they are without outing them, how many of them there are, what sorts of corroboration, what bias they might have. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing that comes down to the day-to-day editing and reporting of stories to make sure that we're as transparent as we can be.
Fiona, at the BBC, do you have any rules or guidelines on the use of anonymous sources?
Yes, we have a whole very comprehensive set of editorial guidelines which we have to abide by, and using a single anonymous source is generally something that has to be referred to the very top of the corporation. But something I'd just like to look back on here is, at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is old-fashioned journalism and our skills in explaining complicated stories in an engaging manner. I think there is a great thirst for people to feel that they're being given the true and useful facts. Reality check that also exists in very long read formats, and I'm always endlessly amazed by the long engagement times we have on those, that people really do want to know and will really read to the end. And I think it just goes back to those old skills that we have to tell the story in the most engaging way and feel that people need to feel that we are accurate and reliable. It's beholden to us to do that. So I just think this style of explaining in a highly relevant way is what what we all need to keep working on. Because if we keep banging on about fake news, that sometimes that can feel like a very niche thing, very far away from a wider audience's world and reality. And it's very in a journalist's world, but it's maybe not necessarily in our readers' world.
And I think that underlines an important point as well, which is that lightly put together, highly viral fake stories may fly around the world, but they don't establish the kind of emotional connection and loyalty that a well-reported story with checkable facts against it will create. So it has some quick ephemeral value, but it's unlikely to have that deeper tie created.
Well, we've had this huge debate in the United States growing out of the Russia investigation about the fake news that was penetrated during the election by, or propagated during the election by Russian bots, by Russian trolls. And we had a hearing before the Congress a week or so ago about the millions of Facebook readers who were exposed to Russian propaganda. How big of an impact do you believe that had if, as you're saying, Quentin, readers are sophisticated and they can see through a lot of phony stuff? Cameron, starting with you, and then let's have everybody answer because we only have 1:30 left.
Sure. The short answer is we just don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot more to learn about, first of all, the pervasiveness of that content and how individual voters reacted to it.
So it may not have had as big an impact as some are suggesting.
Fair enough.
Just one fact that stood out for me in the reporting of those hearings was that people, when they reached those sites, stuck to them and went round further stories on them, and I find that incredibly interesting. So I think there's a lot more to come out, and it will have had greater impact than we thought.
Quick follow-up before I get to Quentin. Did you see that at all during the Brexit referendum in the UK?
We had record traffic during the EU referendum and post the result, and really it was for that explainer kind of information. What is going on? What does it mean? The same when the election happened. What is a hung parliament? It went back to that basic, just tell me what is going on, please, mission.
On my side, again, underlining, I don't know Google policy, but I can say that it seems to be arising in a public debate around new types of literacy and an awareness that you need to check your information much better. And yeah, it's a bad day, but it's also part of a longer learning process that we're all in.
Great, thank you. And it's a big topic and not a lot of time, and we're out of it. But thank you for coming.